Should we be scared about the Department of Education closure Trump promised? I didn't hear him promise a Department of Education closure, but okay. Really liked flexing that federal requirement verbiage. Was often the only way to convince people who thought they were doing the right thing that they weren't actually doing the right thing. Okay, let's start here. You have the federal IDEA. The federal IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Every state had to establish what's called a state plan. They had to, within their state plan, they had to replicate the federal IDEA. They had to replicate it. They cannot go lower than the federal IDEA. They can enhance it if they choose. And if they enhance it, then they pay the difference with regards to, but they already have the primary financial responsibility. The state and the local schools have the primary funding responsibilities. They always have. It was not, this law was a civil rights law. It's a Civil Rights Act passed by Congress to correct historical injustices and disenfranchisement, neglect, apathy, exclusion, all those things that were being committed by the state and local schools. So the federal government didn't do this. So the local schools and state schools did this. So the IDEA was a mechanism to bring uniformity across all 50 states in the Civil Rights Act. But the Civil Rights Act cannot go away if the Department of Education went away. It's a Civil Rights Act. And people go, oh, the funding. The funding is supplemental. The feds didn't do this. Once again, it falls upon the state and the local governments to fund our children's program with equity to everybody else. Now, the feds recognize that there's some additional cost to special education, and this is why they agreed to provide supplemental funding up to, could be, it's optional, could be up to 40%. The feds have never gone above 16 in their supplemental funding. Supplemental, not supplant, supplemental funding. And I think that's where a lot of people get this wrong. You know, they somehow think that the federal government is supposed to fund special education. They're not. They were never intended to be. This isn't their problem. It's a local and state problem. So the federal law, the Civil Rights Act, was to bring that uniformity and some calm to that chaos, so that regardless of what state you move to, there was a uniformity of those protections, okay? And all the rules are there for that. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the federal Department of Education went away. The IDEA would still be intact. Enforcement would still be intact, being that the only enforcement duty that the feds have is with how much money that has been submitted as a state plan as far as their financial commitment. You don't need a Department of Education for them to submit their state plan with regards to what their MOU is, okay? Their maintenance of effort, sorry, MOE, their maintenance of effort requirement, okay? That's part of their state plan, and that's still a requirement. And of course, can states say, well, I'm not gonna take federal money? Yeah, they can do that. It's stupid because it's supplemental. But at the same time, if they reject federal funding for special education, they still have a requirement to provide our children a FAPE because their state code replicates the federal IDEA. So I get that you like to, you know, hey, federal IDEA says this. Well, so does your state code. Your state code replicates the IDEA. Now, you know, so I go in and out. I work in and out between the Texas code, Alabama's code, New Mexico's code, and the IDEA, because they're all interchangeable. They all say the same thing. It's just cosmetically different from state to state with regards to what IEPs look like. But all the IEPs have to have the same stuff in them because that's what the federal law requires. Okay? I think people get caught up about this funding, and the funding is supplemental. And the only enforcement powers that the feds have is on procedure and making sure that the states are complying with their requirement to make sure that the local schools are compliant with procedure. That's it. It's just procedure in federal layer, ensuring that the states are compliant with procedure, and then the state has a responsibility to make sure that the local schools are compliant with procedure. Meaning, do you know what the basic rules are? Are you sending out meeting notices? Are you providing prior written notice? Are you developing the IEPs in the right way? That's what procedure is. But at the end of the day, the only ones that have enforcement duties under this law is you. You as the parent. You're the only one. The state doesn't track whether or not your child was provided a FAPE. Neither does the feds. They don't care. That's not their job. Their job is to make sure that the procedure is followed and understood. They provide guidance to that. But with regards to whether your child received a free, appropriate public education, falls on you. Only you know that. Because everybody along the chain, being the local school, the state, and the federal government, presumes on a yearly basis that your child was provided a FAPE unless you alert them otherwise. Now, how do you alert them otherwise? State complaint, due process complaint, mediation, disagreement in your IEP meeting. But there's got to be action taken by you for enforceability on whether your child received a FAPE. And whether they received a FAPE has nothing to do with procedure. That's substance. That's whether your child regressed, stagnated, and failed to make progress, okay? Or was educationally harmed. I mean, those are the four analyses. That's what a due process case is about with a hearing officer. They don't decide procedure, whether or not there were enough people in your IEP meeting and whether you got meeting notices on time. That's procedure. That's important, and there are times when procedure turns into substantive violations and harm. But most of the time, procedure, they just screwed up. That's a state complaint. That's worthy of a state complaint, not a due process complaint. So there is some different levels and strategies as to what is the best mechanism and best approach to use. I mean, that's why I have Advocates University, guys, to train specifically on this stuff and break it all down. Well, it's also why I have this page, Ask a Special Education Attorney. So to provide this kind of guidance, to raise the level of parent understanding in these areas. But citing the federal law is also citing your state law. Okay, so, it's one and the same. I'm not concerned about whether the federal education department's here or not. There is absolutely no metric since it was created in 1979 as a standalone department. The Department of Education's always been there, guys. It's just been tucked within the Health and Human Services Department. And then in 1979, President Carter created a standalone Department of Education. But since 1979, there has been no metric in reading, in math, in any area that has shown a gain. Okay, so what good has it been other than it takes money that should be devoted to the states and to the local governments, because that's who provides the money to the federal government. The federal government doesn't have a job, guys. It takes money from everybody else. And then it takes what it needs, for all the people who work there, that once again, there's been no metric showing that it's been of any good. And as far as the Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP, that oversees the procedure, just like OCR does for 504, that doesn't need to be in DC. They can have regional offices just like OCR does in order to do compliance for special education. I'm not concerned about the Department of Education. It's absolutely been a waste, a monetary drain, frankly. So, it does not, the IDEA does not rest upon the existence of the Department of Education. It's a Civil Rights Act. Congress created it. Only Congress can do away with it, guys. And I don't see them doing that. All right. And once again, the funding falls upon the states and the local schools first and foremost. Supplemental is what comes from the feds. And that once again goes from Congress. It doesn't come out of the Department of Education. Congress is the one that determines the amount of funding that goes into the supplemental pots of the state governments.